Let's jump in. Welcome, everyone, to the Where Data Meets Business webinar. I'm Sonia Ketkar. I'm a data product consultant, and I work with businesses to apply data driven approaches to achieve business outcomes. In addition to organizing webinars, I also write a newsletter. You can find it at databusiness.substack.com. And I host a podcast called Where Data Meets Business, in which I interview expert professionals from corporate America and startups who work in the data and product spaces. You can find it on Spotify. I am super excited to host today's webinar, which is a follow up to a previous webinar called Storytelling with Data, and an article that appeared in the newsletter, which was written by Christina Boris, who is here with us today. Christina, welcome again. So glad that you're joining us one more time to dive deep into this important topic.
Thanks, Sonia. It's great to be here. I'm excited too. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
So when we had the previous webinar, we had a bunch of questions that came up, and we wanted to address those questions in this session. One of those was related to good versus great storytelling, and we're going to get into that, of course, and a couple of others as well. Before we jump in, a couple of housekeeping points, excuse me, for those of you who are new to StreamYard. Please put your questions in the chat window to the top right hand side of your screen, which is called comments. So if you click on the comments button, it'll open up and you can put your questions in there. We will get to them either during the presentation or then we have time at the end for just dedicated Q&A. So let's get started. Christina, over to you. I'm going to pull up the presentation while you kick it off.
Okay, great. So why don't we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we're going to cover this evening, because we have a few things. And as Sonia mentioned, a few of the agenda items are based on questions we got during and after our first session, as well as topics we'd already planned to talk about. So let's just go through them quickly. First, we'll go over the difference between good and great data stories, which is the title of our session. And then we'll review two different types of summarization that can serve as a starting point for data story development. We'll also share some summarization intake questions that are helpful to have answers to when you're starting a summary exercise. After that, we'll do a deep dive into ways you can summarize a report with a large data chart. This is actually a continuation of our first session. So this is the deep dive that we talked about in the first one that we're doing now. And then at the end, we're going to share the results of what we called our prompting odyssey. This is where we prompted a GenAI tool to recreate a data and report summary that I also did myself manually. And of course, as Sonia said, we've carved out time for Q&A. We're also happy to take questions throughout the talk as well. So just put them in the chat as they come up. All right. So why don't we dive in and go to the next slide?
Yeah, and I'm super excited to talk about the prompting odyssey too, by the way, because we had so much fun with it. So stick around to the end so that
Yeah,
we can share that with you.
absolutely. So as Sonia was saying earlier, one of the questions we received after our first session was, what differentiates a good versus a great storyteller? And that's a really great question. And for the purposes of this talk, we'll focus on good versus great data storytelling. And I mean, truth be told, many of the same elements of a great story also apply to a great data story. The main difference is that data typically plays a starring role in the data story, whereas it may or may not in a regular story. And this slide is really outlining some of the similarities and differences between good and great data stories. And this is based on my own experience and also validated with points from other sources that we'll share with you in a few slides at the end. But let's briefly go through this. So first and foremost, good and great data stories have some common elements. They both typically use high-value data insights as the basis for the story. So you need insights and data. They also aim to simplify complex data and information so that it can be more easily understood by anyone, especially a non-technical audience, especially if you're working and you've got non-research or non-data colleagues that need to consume this information. It's break it down so that everybody can understand the complex. And they also aim to highlight challenges or barriers to overcome, as well as opportunities for exploration, right? So these three things: high value data insights as the foundation, simplifying the complex, and highlighting challenges and opportunities. Those are those underlying commonalities. And they also have some differences. Great data stories will use a few compelling data points in combination with vivid imagery and descriptive language, as well as nuance, to make the audience feel like they are part of that data story and to stir up emotions in that audience. Whereas a good data story will report key data and statistics using a more nondescript or matter-of-fact tone that appeals to the audience's logic or intellect. So a key difference here is one is appealing to the mind more so versus the heart. And when it comes to appealing to the mind, I'm going to quote famed screenwriter Robert McKee. He had an interview with Harvard Business Review. He was saying this can be problematic if you want to motivate people to reach certain goals, because people are not inspired to act on reason alone. So, and that's really key, like not inspired to act on reason alone. And he also said the other way to persuade people, and ultimately a much more powerful way, is by uniting an idea with an emotion. And the best way to do that is by telling a compelling story. So the idea here is a great data story is one that will evoke certain emotions in the audience that will inspire them to act or think or feel differently. So why don't we go to the next slide and we'll show you an example. So here are two different data stories that highlight the results from a fictitious call center satisfaction survey. Now, the metrics, the survey metrics in these stories are real, and the scenario is realistic. Just the scores are not real, okay? So we'll give you 30 seconds to read through them. And as you're reading, keep in mind that a great data story is one that fosters empathy and emotion with the characters in the story versus being purely factual and logical. And as you're reading, I'm going to ask you at the end, like, what do you think, or which story do you think has more elements of a great data story? If you think it's data story number one, type a 1 in the chat. And if you think it's data story number 2, type a 2 in the chat. Okay. So let's give them a little time.
Okay, so while people are, typing in their responses or reading through it, I can
Mm-hmm.
share my experience when you first shared this with me and asked me to
Okay.
tell you which was the good and the great data story. So yeah, folks, 5 more seconds before I jump into that and reveal the answer.
I'm not really looking at the chat. Are people typing in?
We haven't got any
No.
responses as
Okay.
yet. I
Okay.
think, yeah, but I can, it can be, I got it wrong the first time. So I, you know, I should have been a little more shy to give my opinion. But so when Christina first showed me these two stories and asked me to guess which was the um a great one. I was like, oh, well, left-brained, objective, constantly looking, I'm constantly presenting to very sort of quantitative, analytical folks. So my head
Mhm.
immediately, without reading it carefully, went to like, okay, I want to, it's going to be data story one. And I was wrong, because once you pointed out to me that it's not reason alone that drives action, and a great data story is one that drives action, that would be then data story two. We have an answer here, so I'm going to pull that up.
Mhm.
Yep,
Wrong.
that is that is
Yes.
the correct answer,
Yes. Yes.
as I found out later.
Well, I also didn't give you the guidance. I sent these to you, oops, ahead of time, and I didn't say anything to you, whereas I gave the audience more guidance on this. But yes, you are correct. Data story number 2 is the one with more elements of a great data story. And honestly, it's a very fine line, right? I mean, good is still good, right? It's not a bad data story, but why is data story number 2 a more of a great data story? It's because it puts us squarely in the customer's shoes, right? Um, and according to the CMO Alliance, people are far more likely to connect with human characters, in this case, the customer, that they can relate to, like an actual customer, right? And the customer quote, because we're saying it in the customer's own words in data story number 2, that shows the emotional impact that being transferred had on them in the form of frustration and wanting to hang up, right? So the barrier to overcome is they're being transferred, right? They call into the call center, they're trying to accomplish something, they talk with one agent, they don't get it resolved, then they get transferred on. They probably spend some time going through the whole issue with that first agent, then they get transferred and they've got to do it all over again. And that creates a lot of extra effort and frustration. And so that's really, we put it in the customer's own words. And the frustration because they had to put more time and energy and effort into getting what they needed on that call. And that also drives, worsens the customer effort score, right? Because basically they're saying I had to put more effort in order to get what I needed on this call. I couldn't just do it with the first agent. I had to get transferred to another one to resolve my issue or to complete my task. And just as researchers and insights professionals, we're often taught and sometimes even encouraged to be a bit more matter of fact and unemotional when presenting data and research findings, right? Which is different than what a storyteller does, especially a great storyteller, as we were talking about before. The whole point of the story is to evoke emotion, right, in your audience. And so the challenge with framing your insights and takeaways as what I would call cold facts is that it's more difficult, in a lot of ways to evoke that emotion in your stakeholders, which is what you often need to drive action or change. Because a lot of times, like, the story has a barrier, right? Like the transfers are increasing. No one knows why. The customer is, putting in more effort. They're getting a little bit more frustrated. So that's a barrier that needs to be overcome. And so they've got to troubleshoot and figure out what that issue is and change things so that the customer is not getting transferred around and reduces the amount of effort they're putting in going forward. So by telling a story that gives a little bit more emotion, puts you in the customer's shoes, the idea here is that hopefully that will drive more action. Like the call center agents will be more inspired to want to do something about it because they can relate to the customer. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about the characteristics of great data stories, let's talk about ways you can begin crafting one. And I've found that summarization is a great starting point for data story development because it's essentially a method for condensing information and data down into its essence. And that's also really what a data story is about. It's boiling facts and figures and information, data down into their essence. And it's written in a narrative format that will evoke emotion in the reader and hopefully inspire action or a new way of thinking or feeling, right? And so for this talk, we're going to focus on two specific types of summaries: report summaries and data summaries. And both of these summarization methods are used to condense information and data, but they each have a slightly different focus. So let's talk through them. So report summarization, that's what's on the left of the slide. That focuses more on condensing the main points of a report as a way to save readers time and prevent them from information overload in today's fast-paced world where you have so much, information coming at you all the time. Whereas on the right, data summarization focuses on reducing the size and complexity of a data set down to its key patterns and characteristics as a way to provide quick insights for your readers or your audience without them having to dive into all those raw data details. And we'll share examples of this later on in the talk. This is just kind of like the high level overview. So let's go to the next slide. So this slide we dedicated to a question we received in our last session, which was, how do you go about gaining knowledge about your stakeholders' needs for a summary exercise? Which is another great question. And these are some intake questions you can ask when you receive a summary request from someone, or questions you can answer yourself if you're doing a summary exercise on your own. And these are kind of like the base set of questions, and they can change or expand a bit depending on the nature of the summary assignment. It really just depends. And I would argue that these questions, even though they're broken out into, 4 different components, they're all somewhat interrelated. The target audience for the summary, like who's going to be reading the summary, will likely influence the purpose of the summary as well as the use cases for it, right? And the audience and the purpose and the uses for the summary would likely also influence the reports or the data that's prioritized for the summary, as well as the key points and insights that you pull from these sources. And just one thing on point number 4, the one about confirming the scope of work and timeline. One of the questions I have is around, is it just a summary or a summary and a synthesis exercise? And a synthesis exercise is really done more for 2 or more source documents, because a synthesis involves combining insights from multiple sources to create something new, like a new, maybe more enhanced or a broader perspective. It's really a step beyond a summary. And in our first session, we talked about different levels of summarization, with a data story or an insight story being that highest level of summary, which is really more of a synthesis. You're bringing all the insights together from all the documents and source material that you've summarized and creating a cohesive story around it. And that's really the idea here. The initial summarization that you do for each source document is kind of like that first pass at condensing down the information, and then you can continue to synthesize the insights into a data story or an insight story as you go along. And then just on the right, where that little yellow light bulb is, just wanted to highlight that the summary needs intake can be an ongoing process, and that's okay. Sometimes you don't have all the answers right away, and things become clearer as you go through the summary exercise. All right, let's go. So let's talk a little bit about ways to condense a report, the report summarization. So on the left side of our slide here is a screenshot of the cover of a report from the American Lung Association, which is a US nonprofit organization. It's called Driving to Clean Air. And this report is going to serve as our source document for our example, our summary example. Now, I did a manual summary of this report, and then Sonia and I recreated the summary using GenAI, and we'll show you the results of that a little bit later. But But just to tell you a little bit about this report, it's a 7-page research report that they put out in 2023, like 8.5 by 11 pages, chock full of information, as well as a large data chart. And the report really focuses on the impact of air pollution from cars that burn fuel, and that the impact that that has on our health and ways we can reduce those impacts. So that's the report. And then on the right are a few ways to summarize and condense down a report like this. So let's just talk through them real quickly. The first method is really to zone in on the key takeaways that support the summary objectives, which you will hopefully have gotten from your intake questions, like once you got all of those answers. So if we were to take this Driving to Clean Air report as an example, let's say we set the target audience as we want to do a data story or a summary for the general US population, just anybody out there who's interested in the impacts of air pollution. This report does focus on some very high-level facts around this. So I would focus the summary on key points in the report that cover things like the number of Americans who live in areas with unhealthy levels of air pollution. Believe it or not, it's actually about a third of Americans that do. It also covers the negative health impacts of overexposure to air pollution, things like lung cancer, heart disease, and even asthma onset. And then it also talks about the public health benefits overall, so like the cumulative benefits if the US were to transition over to cleaner cars and electricity generation in the next 10 years. And they're saying that if all states transitioned over fully, we could reach around $1 trillion in cumulative health benefits. So that's the idea about the key takeaways and aligning them with your summary objectives. A second way is to condense key points that are stated multiple times and in slightly different ways. And this is related to the first point. But what I found is I've done many of these summarizations. A lot of reports will restate the same key points multiple times and sometimes in slightly different ways. And this really tells me two things. One, it's a key point that the author of the report really wants to drive home. They want you to remember that as a key takeaway. And two, it's also an opportunity to condense. Because in a summary, each key takeaway really only needs to be stated once with some supporting points. And so if we were to take this report as an example, one of the main points, and I touched on it earlier, is that the US could really see significant public health benefits if every state were to fully transition away from cars and power plants that burn fuel and switch over to 100% zero emission cars and electricity. So think like electric vehicles by 2035. Now, this point, this about the transition and the benefits was mentioned and referenced multiple times in this report. I think maybe 7 or 8 times, maybe more, in a 7-page report. So we know it's important. We know it's a key takeaway. And I also knew it was an opportunity to collapse this key point down into one concise and cohesive summary point, right? So that's the second way. And then the third way is, this is a great way too, to summarize and simplify any data charts and graphs that are in your report for your readers or your audience so that they don't have to do all the mental work, right? So taking this report as an example, on pages 5 and 6 of the report, there is a very large data chart with a breakdown by US state. And we'll show you what that looks like a little later on. And the data chart spans 1.5 pages of this report. So out of a 7-page report, we've got a data chart that's 1.5 pages, right? So that's like almost a fifth or a little over a fifth of the report, right? So this also presented a big opportunity to summarize and simplify the complex, as we talked about before, for your readers so that they don't have to do all the extra work. All right, so let's go through the next couple slides. We're going to show you a few simple ways you can summarize the data chart. So here it is. This is a screenshot on the left of the data chart from the report. And just a couple of quick definitions here. So according to ThoughtSpot, data stories are often compared with data visualizations, but they're a little bit different. They talk about data visualizations as being just one piece of data stories and are used oftentimes as an aid to tell a broader story. And I would say this is the case with this state level breakdown. There's a lot of little stories in here that weren't necessarily fully covered in the report that you could actually like take in a whole new direction. And Tableau has also defined data visualization as the graphical representation of information and data that uses visual elements. So things like charts and graphs and maps as a way to provide an accessible way to see and understand trends and outliers and patterns in the data. So what we're seeing, this chart is really a data visualization in the form of a data chart in the report. And so that's the chart. And then on the right are a few simple ways that you can summarize a data chart like this from an industry report or a research report. So let's just talk through them really quickly. And we have a couple of examples in the following slides. So the first thing you can do is write up a high-level description of the chart contents, just like explaining what it's covering. You can also count up things in the chart, and we'll show you an example of that. You can look at highs and lows or minimum and maximum numbers as a way to better understand the figures in the chart. You can note any key patterns or trends that you see in the chart and kind of summarize that. And you can also kind of summarize the main takeaway of the chart, what you think it's really saying or what the key point is for your readers. And these are just a couple of examples. There are so many different ways you could summarize and analyze the data in this chart. The methods here on this slide are really more descriptive and good for summarization, and there are also some more in-depth analyses that you could certainly do as well. So let's go to the next slide and we'll show you an example. So as I was saying before, describing the contents in a data chart is a great way to kick off the chart summarization because it helps ensure you understand what that chart is covering, right? Sometimes, we're looking at things so quickly, it's like, okay, wait a minute, what is this chart actually depicting? So this is a good way to make sure that you understand everything that it's covering. So on the left-hand side is a partial screenshot of the data chart in the report, and it's been enlarged. The items in yellow circles and yellow squares are the chart headers that I am describing. That's what's on the right. And I added these for illustrative purposes. They were not part of the original chart. They're just to kind of help call some things out. So what is the high-level description of this chart? Well, it's a breakdown of U.S. state by U.S. state of the projected or the forecasted public health benefits, like overall cumulative public health benefits, both monetary as well as physical health benefits, that could potentially be reached by 2050 if each U.S. state fully transitions over to cleaner cars and electricity in the next 10 years. And it's also depicting the level of adoption of state-level emission standards by state. So breaking it down a little bit further, the states are listed in alphabetical order in the blue column at the far left. The health benefits, both monetary as well as physical, like, number of asthma attacks avoided and things like that, those are in the white columns. And then the green columns are the 3 different state-level emission standards. And so that is really what this chart is covering. And going back to the point about the summary needs intake being an ongoing process, a description of a chart like this would be something that you'd probably would be a good thing to go back to your summary requester with and just say, take a break and go back to them and say, hey, in this report, there's this very large data chart and it's covering, state level detail. Let's say you're working in the state of Montana, do you want me to do any further like analysis or summary of the data from Montana, the information from Montana? So there's lots of different things that you could do. And it's just a good way to go back to the requester and kind of refine those needs and make sure that you're covering everything that that target audience might be interested in. So, this gives us an idea of what the chart is about. Now let's go to the next slide and see a different type of chart summary example. So, as I talked about earlier, counting up items in a chart is also a really good way to summarize. And the first time I looked at this chart, I really wanted to understand what were those little black dots and what are the blank green cells? Like, what did those mean? And again, with the yellow boxes, I added those. They highlight the 3 state level emission standards, and the green circles I also added, and they represent states that have adopted all 3 of these state level standards. So basically what those 3 columns to the far right are saying is a black dot means a US state has adopted that specific state level emission standard. And a blank green cell means that a US state has not adopted that standard, and they're all under the Clean Air Act. And just through counting, I was able to conclude that as of the time this report was published, which was about 2 years ago, June 2023, 7 states, US states, had adopted all 3 emission standards, the state level standards. 11 states had adopted 1 or 2 of those standards, and 31 states had not adopted any of them. So you can learn a lot just by counting things up in a report. And there's many other things you can count too, but this was something that piqued my curiosity, and so I did this counting exercise on my own. And Sonia and I actually recreated this summary using a GenAI tool, and we are going to show you how that turned out.
Yes. So, okay, so that's pretty much what we wanted to do, which was see if we can take that table, we can get an AI tool to actually read through the table, understand it, and then spit out some of the answers that we were looking for. But the first decision that we had to make was pick which AI tool to use for this exercise. There are a lot of options out there, right? There's ChatGPT, which is made by OpenAI. There's Perplexity. There are all the big company ones like Google's Notebook LM, Microsoft's Copilot, and so on and so forth. But one of the tools that I really like to use is this one called Claude. It's made by this company called Anthropic. And the reason I like it is because I tend to err on the side of caution and I take my privacy very seriously. So the way Claude works is when you have conversations with the program or the tool, if you ask it any questions, give it any feedback, the tool or Anthropic, which again owns the tool, they don't use that information to then train the models. So, your information is used for that particular event or that incident or that set of questions, and then that's pretty much it. The other thing is I feel safer uploading documents if I need to for the same reason. And the other thing is that it doesn't really save any of your information, which also makes me feel good, right? Because some of the other tools do save your information, unless you specifically ask them not to. So those were some of the reasons why I often use Claude. That doesn't mean that I exclusively use Claude. I've used some of the other tools as well. But anyway, for this particular exercise, even though it was a public report, a publicly available report, I decided that we should use Claude. So we want to walk you through the different steps, literally step by step as to how this went. So I'm going to bring up the next slide. So here we go. So the first thing I did was I want to upload a document. This is what I put in Claude. And it said, oh, yeah, happy to help you. Here's how you upload a document. So I'm like, great, very supportive. And you can see the PDF document that has been uploaded there towards the bottom of the screen. The next piece of it was to tell it what to do, with that document. So as it says there, the prompt was, give me the summary of the table in the document. And you'll see that it has, summarized each of the columns, told you what each of the columns is. So pretty much similar to what Christina was talking about in the previous few slides, which is describing the columns and, getting into the details of each one. So then it sort of gave us the key highlights. Now, this is where it got interesting because as you can see in the font that has been, that has the red box around it, it made a counting error. So it told us that there are 6 states that have adopted the ACC2 standard, but because Christina had done the work before, she was able to quickly point out and say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that. I'm pretty sure it's 7 states. And you see the 7 states are listed there. So we're like, okay, this is not good. So, especially if you're going to use AI exclusively to summarize a report or a table, then if it gets something wrong, you're not going to notice it if you haven't, done the counting manually previously. So, here's what we did. We then said to it, that okay, so fine, maybe you got the counting wrong, but maybe you'll be able to list the states correctly. So we've asked it to list the states which have adopted both ACC 1 and 2 emission standards, and once again it got them wrong. So this time we said, okay, we're going to point it out to them, or to the tool, and say, Virginia is one of those that has adopted these emission standards. Why did you miss it? And as you can see, it tells you that that we were right, and that it missed it. Now, what's really interesting is here we kind of said, okay, fine, it got it, it got it wrong, and we corrected it, and it admitted its mistake, and so on. But what we could have also done, which I have sort of discovered in other exercises where I've used Claude for prompting, is we could have asked it to go back and check its own work before pointing it out, which is something that I've done in the past. And a lot of the times then it discovers that it has missed something and tells you that it has missed something, right? So keep in mind, you can always tell it to check its own work. It's not guaranteed that it'll get it right that time, but it is one more prompt that you can use to try to get closer and closer to the answer that you want, or to the right answer. So we decided to approach it in one more way, which was, as you see on this slide, we said, okay, now can you actually tell us how many states have not adopted any of these standards? And it got it right. Not only the number, but also the list of steps. So once again, it shows you that it can get some of the things right, some of the things wrong. One of the areas in which a lot of these, whether it's ChatGPT or a lot of these tools used to get it wrong a lot more, was in counting exercises. So while it gets the text and the words in the summarization part, a lot of the times there are many examples of how many of these tools have got the counting piece wrong. So another thing to keep in mind as you move on and use these tools. Now, of course, AI is moving so quickly, and new versions of these tools are coming out so quickly that they fix these problems very fast. So it doesn't mean that because this counting error exists today, it's going to continue to exist a week from now. It might not even fix it. The challenges of keeping up to date with things sometimes. But either way, we thought this was a really interesting exercise because one of the pros of using any of these AI tools is that you can save a lot of time, But on the other hand, you just have to be really, really careful. You have to have what they call HITL, which is human in the loop. That is to get a person to review, or you should yourself ideally be that person who reviews it. And I would say, if you have a list of tasks that you need to complete and you want to use an AI tool to do it, rank them in order of importance to the performance of, if it's business related, to the performance of your business. If it's personal, again, you weight based on importance, and the more important the task, the more you should have a human in the loop, at least for now, because while these tools are advanced and advancing very quickly, they're not completely there yet. Christina, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think having the human in the loop and asking it to check its work. I mean, in this case, I had already done the summary manually, so I knew all of the answers already, which was helpful because we, it was easy to spot the mistakes, and we also knew how to prompt it for other things. We knew which state was missing, right? So we could prompt it, and we also knew how to ask it or to test its counting capabilities another way. But the idea is you want to save yourself from having to do a summary like this manually. So I think it's helpful to ask it to check its work, and you check its work as well. And just even having a very high level understanding of the source documents, like even if you just briefly read through or skim through them so you know what the contents are, can be helpful too. I still think it's going to save you a lot of time from having to do it all manually, but it's kind of more of this hybrid approach, right, Sonia, that we talked about in our last session, where you're partnering with the AI tool to help make things more efficient, and it returned a very good summary. Aside from like the counting error, I thought Claude's summary was really good and was very similar to the summary that I did. So the quality is there. You just have to make sure that everything is accurate, and that's where the human comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So, to kind of just summarize what we just spoke about earlier too, some of the pros of these AI tools is that, of course, super fast and efficient. I mean, that entire prompting session was like a few minutes. Um, it is very good at drawing out some of the key details, except of course counting. Good at connecting a few of the points, as it did with the table, as you saw in the previous slides. Some of the cons, of course, counting, we talked about that already. And the big one here is not as good with providing context. So while it was able to do all of the above, pull all the information, if you want to tell a great story, just like we talked about, at the beginning of this session, you're going to have to do that, on your own, because it's not as good with providing context. It can take information, but the stories, all of that has, at this point at least, it's better if you kind of get good at that skill set, because it's still invaluable. And it's harder for it to identify emotions, the kind of emotions, not just general emotions, but the kind of emotions you need, which provide context and which provide that trigger to motivate action. So yeah, any thoughts you want to add here, Christina?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's you need that human component to be able to provide that context, and also frame it in such a way that will evoke the emotion. Like we can detect that, or from reading the source material, it doesn't always come out that way in the output. It's just more, it's a very nice summary, but it really takes that, I guess, human judgment to be able to add that context and maybe identify the emotions, if anything, that are relatable, that are coming from this source material, and how to frame it in a way that's going to inspire your audience to think or feel or act differently.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that ends our the part that we wanted to cover here today. We would love to hear your questions, so please put them in the comments box. Some of the sources that are cited, I'm not going to stop on each slide here, but I'm going to post it on our YouTube channel tomorrow, which is it's called Where Data Meets Business, and you'll also get an email with that information. So yeah, would love to hear your questions. This is Christina's contact information. Christina, thanks so much. This was amazing, and the good versus great story piece of it, especially, which of course I have to keep that in mind if I'm trying, depending on the goal for the story that I'm writing. I have to keep in mind that that's what you do to get a great story.
Yeah,
So
it's a different way of reporting out, or sharing information, like in data, right? It's a little different than what you see sometimes, and so it does take a different type of, I guess, writing and thinking.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah,
I,
folks,
I have
any
a question
questions?
for you, actually.
Oh,
Going back to what you were saying about Claude not keeping your information. how do you does it give you something that says, okay, I've deleted, your data, or have you ever gone back and checked to see if I don't know, your source material or whatever you uploaded into Claude is still there? I'm just curious
Yeah, so that's a
how
really
that
good
works.
question because it gives you a very vague answer, right? So first I asked it for one of my other projects. I asked it if it would save it for me, and it said it doesn't do that. So it doesn't save it. So the only way to save it would be for me to export it, and it gives you the option to do that. So you can export it or you can copy paste it into, some a Word document or whatever
Hmm.
other tool. So that's one part of it. Then and I did go back, and the other thing that where it doesn't give you an exact number, is I asked it if that information would be there if I closed out of the program and got back to it, and it said it would depend. In some cases yes, some cases no. So I think it just
Hmm.
depends on when the program gets updated and then information gets deleted. The other thing is, if you're using the free account, which is what I was at the time, um, it just, if there is too much traffic and too many people using it, it'll tell you that you can only ask questions up to say 7 p.m. today, and then you can come back 5 hours later and then put in new requests. So it's kind of
Really?
interesting because, yeah, so it's a little bit vague on that. So there are times when I've gone back and my information's completely gone from, the history's gone. At other times I've gone in and the history is still there. So
Hmm.
very vague on that. But given that they've been so public about the fact that they don't share it,
Yeah.
save anything, I tend to believe them.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions I'm going to pull onto the screen. Here's one.
Okay. Have I done any facilitated storytelling? Yes, I have. In a corporate setting, I have, where um, especially for thought leadership research, for public release, where, usually for a project like that, we'll have a whole group of stakeholders from different areas within the company. It could be sales, marketing, product, and we all kind of come to the table. We plan out the types of questions that we want to research, and then we go out and we get that feedback, and then when we get the results back, we come back and we look at some of the key findings. And usually then we'll have somebody, let's say from our PR team there and from our editorial team, and together we start framing out a story. What's that story going to be? What are the things that we want to be talking about in market? What are the things that, knowing who our key audience is, our target audience, like what do we think is going to be of most interest? How are we going to frame this? What's going to be the story? And how are we going to tie some of these findings together? And, do we have a take on this? Like, what's our perspective? So yeah, that is a common approach. And it's so much fun. It's one of my most favorite types of projects because you're working with so many people, and it's fun to create the story collaboratively with so many different perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. Storytelling, data analysis can get lonely at times when you're just working on your
Yeah.
own.
Yeah, it's
Um,
fun, but it's more fun to do it with others, I think. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, I can take this one. Is it a good approach to analyzing the emotion as the human in the loop, define the sentiment and ask an LLM to make a story for you? Yeah, so you can definitely define the sentiment and ask an LLM to make a story for you, and you can even ask it to make a story with some more features in there too. So you can say, make up a story for me of a um person who feels sad because they lost their puppy, or something like that, and it'll definitely make up that story for you. So that can be done. I guess the point that we were making previously was that not that it cannot identify emotions. If you have a bunch of text or so on, it would be able to identify the emotions in many cases. What is hard for it to do is tell the story, tell a story based on some of the information that already exists. Like for in the report that we were discussing previously, it would take many, many prompts and a lot of testing and trial and error to be able to get it to provide a context or tell a story based on a report, and a story that again triggers action, resonates with people. So, all the different features that Christina pointed out in one of the previous slides, which were the ingredients of a great story, it might not be able to do that as well as a human can. So, that is the difference between, I guess, the part one of your question and part two. I hope that helps. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, in that case, thank you everyone for joining this session. Once again, thank you, Christina. It was, as usual, this is a great informative session, and I took away a lot, of course. And to everyone who has joined us this evening from various locations in the world, thank you.